I want to tell you something before I tell you everything else. I want to tell you that I am not a man who has spent his life waiting to be repaid for anything. I am not a man who kept a ledger of good deeds, who counted the kindnesses he had extended and expected the arithmetic of the universe to eventually balance in his favor. I did what I did in my life because it was what I believed a person ought to do, and I asked nothing in return from anyone, not from the strangers I had helped, not from the son I had raised alone, not from the God I had prayed to in the years when prayer was the only resource I had left. I am telling you this not because I want your sympathy, but because I want you to understand the kind of man I was before the week that changed everything. So that when I tell you what happened, you will understand that I did not see it coming. I never see these things coming. That is perhaps both my greatest weakness and the only thing about myself I have never wanted to change. My name is Thomas Harris. I am 71 years old, and until 14 months ago, I lived in a small house on Clement Street in a neighborhood that had grown up around me over the course of 3 decades, where I knew the names of the families on either side, and the woman who walked her arthritic beagle every morning at 7, and the teenage boy 2 doors down, who had recently started leaving for school 20 minutes earlier than he used to, which I noticed and chose to interpret as a hopeful sign. It was not a large house, and it was not a valuable house by the standards of people who measure houses by their value, but it was mine, paid for over 30 years on a postal worker's salary after my wife Carol passed and left me with Derek, who was 11 years old and needed stability more than anything else a grieving father could offer. I gave him the house. I gave him the consistency of the same walls and the same street and the same neighbors, and I went to work every morning and came home every evening and made dinner and helped with homework and tried to be enough, which is the only thing a parent in that situation can do, and which is never quite enough, but must be offered anyway. Derek is 44 years old now. He works in commercial real estate, lives in a newer part of the city in a house that is significantly larger than the one he grew up in, which I know because I have driven past it exactly once, 2 years ago, on an afternoon when I was in that part of the city for an appointment and told myself I was simply curious, which was not entirely true. He has a wife named Sandra, and 2 children I have met a handful of times, the younger of whom, a girl named Lily, has Carol's eyes in a way that costs me something every time I see it. Derek and I have never been easy with each other. I want to be honest about that. I want to resist the temptation that comes with telling a story like this. The temptation to make yourself the uncomplicated victim and the other person the uncomplicated villain, because real people are more complicated than that. And I owe it to the truth to say that Derek and I have been failing each other in smaller ways for a long time before the week that broke us open. The diagnosis came 18 months ago. Esophageal cancer stage 3 found late, because I had been attributing the difficulty swallowing to age and stubbornness, and a general disinclination to visit doctors that Carol had always found exasperating, and that I had never entirely outgrown. The oncologist was a young woman with a direct and unhurried manner that I immediately respected, and she told me what I was facing with the honesty I had asked for. And then she told me about a surgical procedure, newer, more aggressive, more effective than the standard protocol for my stage and my specific presentation. That was not covered by my insurance and would cost more money than my retirement account contained by a significant margin. I went home to my house on Clement Street that evening, and I sat in the kitchen where I had eaten breakfast every morning for 30 years, and I looked at the walls and I made the only calculation that was available to me. And by morning, I had made my decision. Some decisions are difficult, and some decisions are simply the only door in the room. This was the second kind. I sold the house. Every last thing that mattered and everything that didn't. What happened after that is what I need to tell you. The process of selling a house you have lived in for 30 years is not simply a transaction. I want you to understand that before I describe it, because the word transaction implies a clean exchange between 2 parties who are both gaining something, and what I was doing was not that. What I was doing was closer to a kind of controlled dismantling, a systematic separation of myself from every physical object that had accumulated meaning over the course of a life, each one carrying the particular weight of the memory attached to it. Each one requiring a private and unwitnessed moment of goodbye before it could be handed over to someone who would carry none of that weight and would therefore be able to use it without cost. Carol's rocking chair went first, to a young woman from a neighborhood church who came on a Saturday morning and sat in it briefly before deciding, running her hands along the armrests with the unconscious tenderness of someone who senses that an object has been loved. I watched her load it into her truck, and I went back inside and stood in the corner where it had been, and I told Carol, quietly, in the way I still talk to her sometimes in empty rooms, that I was sorry, and that I hoped she understood, and that I believed she would. The books went to the public library 3 blocks away, 4 boxes of them, carried in 2 trips. The furniture went piece by piece over 2 weekends, some sold and some given away, and by the 3rd week the house had the particular quality of emptiness that is not peaceful but hollow. The sound of footsteps changed by the absence of everything that had softened them. I called Derek on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the diagnosis and 1 week before the closing date on the house. I had been deliberate about the timing, had wanted to have concrete information to offer him, a plan already in motion rather than a problem arriving without shape or edges, because I know my son well enough to know that what he struggles most with is uncertainty, the feeling of being asked to respond to something before he understands its dimensions. I told him about the cancer directly and without softening it. I told him about the procedure and the cost. I told him I had found a buyer for the house and that the closing would cover the surgery and the recovery costs with a small amount remaining, and that I was calling not to ask for money, but to tell him what was happening, and to ask if I could stay with him and Sandra during the recovery period, which the surgeon had estimated at 6 to 8 weeks. There was a silence on the line after I finished. Not the silence of someone processing difficult news, but a different quality of silence, tighter, more deliberate. The silence of someone choosing words rather than finding them. Then Derek said, "Dad, Sandra and I have talked about this kind of situation before." I said, "What kind of situation?" He said, "This kind, where something happens and there's an expectation that we'll step in." I held the phone, and I looked at the wall of the kitchen where Carol's calendar had hung for 22 years, the nail still there, and I said slowly, "Derek, I'm not asking you to step in. I'm asking if I can sleep in your guest room for 6 weeks while I recover from cancer surgery." He said, "It's not a good time. The kids have their schedules. Sandra has her work. We don't have the capacity right now." I said I understood. I said good night. I set the phone down on the counter, and I stood in the empty kitchen for a long time, and then I washed my face at the sink, and I went to bed on the floor, because the bed had been sold 4 days earlier. The surgery happened on a Thursday in March. It went well. The surgeon used that word, well, with the careful qualification of a person who knows that well is a relative term in the context of stage 3 esophageal cancer, but who also means it genuinely within those relative terms. I spent 11 days in the hospital. A neighbor named Ruth, 73 years old, a retired school teacher who had brought meals to my door every time I was sick for the past 15 years, came to see me twice. A former co-worker named Bill came once and brought a crossword puzzle book and stayed for 2 hours saying very little, which was exactly right. Derek did not come. He sent a text message on the 4th day that said, "Hope the surgery went well." 3 words of punctuation separating a man from his father's operating table. When I was discharged, I had nowhere to go. This is the sentence I have had the most difficulty saying out loud in the months since, not because it shames me, but because it still carries the particular quality of unreality that certain true things carry. The feeling that you are describing something that happened to someone else in a story you read, rather than something that happened to you in the city where you have lived for 40 years. I had given the house keys to the new owners 3 days before the surgery, having arranged to stay in a motel for those 3 days, using the small remaining amount from the sale. But 11 days in the hospital had consumed what I had set aside for the recovery period, and when the discharge nurse asked me for my home address, and I gave her the motel address, and she looked up and said, "Sir, that motel closed last month." I sat in the wheelchair in that hospital corridor, and I felt something shift inside my chest that had nothing to do with the surgical wound. A hospital social worker named Patricia spent 2 hours on the phone trying to find me a bed in a transitional housing facility. There were waiting lists. There were intake requirements. There were processes designed for situations exactly like mine, that nonetheless could not accommodate the specific shape of mine in the specific time frame of mine. Patricia gave me the address of a shelter on Morrison Street that had walk-in availability, a list of community resources printed on a single sheet of paper, and the expression of a woman who cares deeply about her work and is confronted daily with the gap between what the system intends and what it delivers. I thanked her. I meant it. I called Derek from a bench outside the hospital. I want to be precise about this because I have told this part of the story to myself many times in the months since, and I want to make sure I am not softening it in either direction. I did not call him in desperation. I did not call him crying or accusing or making demands. I called him the way I would call a practical acquaintance to relay logistical information, because I had decided that whatever emotion the situation warranted I would process later, privately, and that what the moment required was clarity. I told him I had been discharged. I told him the motel had closed. I told him I had a list of shelter options, but that the closest one was 4 miles from the hospital, and I was 11 days post-surgery, and had been advised not to walk more than a quarter mile. I asked him if he could come and get me. He said, and I am going to give you his exact words, because they are the words I have returned to most often in the months since, not with bitterness, but with the particular attention we pay to things that reveal something fundamental. He said, "Dad, you made your choices your whole life. The house, the way you lived, never saving properly, never planning. I have a family to think about. I can't keep being responsible for the consequences of choices you made before I was even born. You need to live with them." Then he said, "I hope you feel better," and he ended the call. I sat on that bench for a while. The afternoon light was doing something specific with the hospital windows across from me, catching in the glass in a way that made the building look briefly golden. And I watched it, and I thought about Carol, who would have known what to say in this moment, and would have said it in a way that left room for dignity on all sides, which was a gift she had that I never fully inherited. I thought about the 30 years on Clement Street. I thought about the 11-year-old boy I had come home to every evening after Carol died, the boy I had made breakfast for every morning and helped with algebra and driven to soccer practice in a car that needed new brakes, but that I kept running for another 4 months because new brakes were the difference between Derek's registration fee for the fall season and Derek not playing at all. I thought about all of it not with self-pity, but with the honest accounting of a man trying to understand what a life adds up to. Then I folded the list Patricia had given me, put it in my jacket pocket, and I walked the 4 miles to the shelter on Morrison Street. It took me 1 hour and 40 minutes, and I had to stop and sit on 3 different benches along the way, and by the time I arrived, my shirt was damp and the surgical site was making itself known, with the insistent language of healing tissue pushed past its current limits. But I arrived. The shelter had 1 bed available. I took it. I stayed 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, I woke before the others, dressed carefully in the bathroom mirror, and went outside and sat on the front steps in the early April air and watched the street come slowly to life. A delivery truck, a woman with a stroller, a dog pulling its owner toward a smell on the far curb with the absolute conviction of someone who has identified a priority. I was sitting there with my hands between my knees and the list from Patricia folded in my jacket pocket when a black SUV turned onto Morrison Street and slowed and stopped directly in front of the shelter. The woman who got out was perhaps 55 or 60, Chinese-American, dressed in dark professional clothing with the composed and purposeful bearing of someone who has covered a significant distance to be in a specific place and has no doubt that she is in the right one. She looked at the building. Then she looked at me. She crossed the sidewalk without hesitation and stopped in front of me, and she said, with a directness that had nothing unkind in it, "Are you Thomas Harris?" I said yes. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not immediately read, something between relief and a more complicated emotion that I would only understand later. She said, "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Harris. You really shouldn't be here." Then she reached into the bag on her shoulder, and she took out an envelope and she held it out to me and she said, "My name is Margaret Chen. My father was James Way. And there is something you need to know. There are moments in a life that you remember not because you chose to preserve them, but because they preserved themselves. because something in the weight of the moment, or the quality of the light, or the specific arrangement of circumstances, burned the details into a place in the mind that ordinary forgetting cannot reach. I have a small number of those moments. The morning Carol told me she was pregnant with Derek. The afternoon the doctor told me she was gone. A Tuesday evening 15 years ago, when I was walking home from the pharmacy on Burnside Street, a paper bag in one hand and my jacket collar turned up against the October wind, when I looked to my left and saw a young man walking directly into the path of a car that was moving too fast for the conditions and showing no signs of slowing. I did not think. I want to be precise about this because in the years since, when I have occasionally told this story, people have asked what went through my mind in that moment, and the honest answer is nothing. There was no calculation, no assessment of risk, no moment of deliberation between self-preservation and intervention. There was simply the car and the young man and the distance between them, and my body made a decision that my mind had no part in. I dropped the paper bag, and I crossed the sidewalk, and I took the young man by the shoulder, and I pulled us both sideways onto the curb with perhaps 2 seconds and 18 inches to spare, close enough that the side mirror of the car passed through the space where he had been standing, and left a rush of displaced air that I still remember on my face. We sat on the curb for a moment, both of us catching our breath. The young man was 20 years old, I would learn this later, with dark hair and headphones around his neck, and an expression of someone who has just been given a very direct piece of information about the relationship between attention and consequence. He looked at me with eyes that were wide and not yet entirely present, still somewhere in the gap between what had almost happened and what had actually happened, which is where the mind goes in those first seconds after a near miss while the body accounts for itself. Then he said, in a voice that was quieter than I expected from someone his age, "You just saved my life." I said I wasn't sure about that. I said the car might have braked. He looked at me and said, "It didn't brake. I heard it accelerate." And we sat there on that Burnside Street curb in the October wind, two strangers with the particular and disorienting intimacy of people who have just shared something irreversible. And after a moment, I picked up my pharmacy bag from where it had landed, miraculously intact. And I asked him if he was all right, and he said yes, and I said good. And I stood up and straightened my jacket, and I went home. He found me 3 days later. I still do not know with complete certainty how, whether he had seen something with my name on it in the commotion, or asked someone nearby, or simply possessed the particular resourcefulness of a young man who has decided that something matters and is prepared to pursue it accordingly. He knocked on the door of the house on Clement Street on a Friday afternoon, and when I opened it, he was standing there with a paper bag from the Chinese restaurant 2 blocks over and an expression that contained both nervousness and determination in equal measure. He said his name was James Way. He said he had brought lunch because he didn't know what else to bring. I said that was fine, and I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table and we ate from the containers he'd brought, and he told me about himself in the direct and slightly formal way of a young person who has prepared what they want to say and is delivering it with care, that he was studying computer science at Portland State, that he was the son of immigrants, that his father had worked in a restaurant kitchen for 20 years to afford his tuition, that he understood what it meant when someone did something for you that cost them something, even when they insisted it hadn't. I told him he was overstating what I had done. He said with a quiet certainty that settled the matter, "Mr. Harris, I know what I saw. Please let me have lunch with you." So I did. He came back the following Friday, and the Friday after that. For nearly 2 years, James Way came to the house on Clement Street most Friday afternoons, and we ate lunch at the kitchen table and talked about things that had nothing to do with the event that had brought him there, about his coursework and his ideas about technology, about Carol, and about Derek, and about the neighborhood, about a trip I had taken with Carol to New Mexico the year before she got sick, that I still thought about more than any other memory of that period. He was one of the most genuinely curious people I had ever known, with the particular quality of attention that makes a person feel that what they are saying is being received fully rather than simply heard. And I found in our Friday conversation something I had not realized I was missing: the easy companionship of someone who was present without agenda, who came each week simply because he wanted to be there. Then he graduated. A company in San Francisco had offered him a position that was, by any measure available to a 22-year-old, extraordinary. The kind of offer that a person with his ability and his drive and his father's sacrifices behind him could not reasonably decline. And I told him so directly when he came to tell me about it. He sat at that kitchen table with something between excitement and guilt on his face, and I said, "James, you go. You build what you're capable of building. That's what Friday afternoons were for." He laughed, the real laugh, the one I'd heard perhaps a dozen times over 2 years, that arrived without warning and occupied his whole face. He shook my hand when he left. He said he'd stay in touch. In the way of people who mean it fully at the moment they say it and then are swallowed by the velocity of a life that is finally moving at the speed it was built for, the contact became less frequent, and then occasional, and then, without either of us choosing it, absent. The last message I received from James Way was a text on my birthday 4 years ago. A simple "Happy birthday, Mr. Harris. Hope you're well," followed by a photograph of a skyline I recognized as Seattle. I replied with "Thank you, James," and kept the photograph. I did not know he had become wealthy. I want to be honest about that. I had no knowledge of what James Way had built in the years after San Francisco. No awareness of the company he had founded, or the systems his team had developed, or the trajectory that a 22-year-old eating takeout at a kitchen table on Clement Street had been quietly aimed at all along. I had lived my small life in my small house on my small street, and I had thought of him sometimes on Friday afternoons with the warm and uncomplicated feeling of someone remembering a good thing. And I had not known that 3,000 miles away, the young man from the curb on Burnside Street had built something with $42 million attached to it. I did not know he had been sick. I did not know about the autoimmune disease, about the diagnosis that had arrived 2 years earlier, and the months of treatment, and the point at which the treatment had done what it could, and what remained was the particular clarity that arrives when a person understands they are in the final chapter and must decide how it reads. I did not know that in those final months, James Way had sat with his attorneys and his daughter Margaret and worked through the careful architecture of a will with the same methodical attention he had brought to everything in his life, and that somewhere in that architecture, in a clause that his attorneys had described as unusual, and that he had insisted upon, with the quiet finality of a man who knows his own mind, was a provision that set aside 1/3 of his estate, $14 million, for a retired postal worker named Thomas Harris, who had dropped a pharmacy bag on a Tuesday evening 15 years ago and pulled a stranger off the street without thinking twice. Margaret reached into her bag and produced a second envelope, thicker than the first, and placed it on the step beside me. She said, "My father drafted a letter. He wanted you to have his words before anything legal was explained." Her voice was steady, but carried underneath it the specific weight of a daughter who has been holding her father's final wishes for some time and is now at the last step of fulfilling them, which is both a relief and its own kind of grief. I took the letter from the envelope. It was handwritten, 3 pages in the careful and slightly formal script of a man for whom English was a second language, learned with effort and maintained with pride. I will not reproduce every word James wrote because some of it belongs only to me. But I will tell you what he said at the beginning and what he said at the end. At the beginning, he wrote, "Thomas, I have thought about that Tuesday evening on Burnside Street almost every day for 15 years. Not because I am dramatic about it, but because it is the truest thing I know. That a man I had never met chose, without hesitation, to step between me and whatever was coming. I have tried to live in a way that justified that choice. I hope I have come close." At the end, he wrote, "You told me once that the best things you had given your life to were the things that couldn't be measured. I think you were right. But I also think the immeasurable deserves at least once to be met with something concrete. Please accept this, not as payment, because what you did cannot be paid for, but as one man's attempt to say, clearly and permanently, that what you are worth has never had anything to do with what you owned. I sat on the steps of that shelter on Morrison Street, with James Way's letter in my hands, and Margaret Chen beside me in the early April light, and I did not speak for a long time. Not because I was overwhelmed, though I was, but because some moments require the courtesy of silence before they can be entered properly, before a person can walk through what has just been handed to them without damaging it with a response that hasn't yet earned itself. Margaret did not rush me. She sat with the patience of a woman who has her father's quality of attention, and she let the morning be what it was. Margaret drove me to breakfast at a place she knew near the waterfront, a quiet corner restaurant with windows that looked out over the river, and a morning light that came through them at an angle that made everything on the table look deliberate and still, the way light behaves in paintings. We sat across from each other, and she ordered coffee, and I ordered the same, and we talked for 2 hours with the unhurried ease of two people who have already shared something significant and are now simply learning each other on the other side of it. She told me about her father in the way that daughters talk about fathers they have genuinely admired, with the particular mixture of pride and grief that arrives when love and loss occupy the same tense, when the person you are describing is both fully present in your words and fully absent in the room. She told me that James had spoken of me throughout her childhood, that he had described the Tuesday evening on Burnside Street to her when she was 12 years old, sitting at their kitchen table in Seattle, trying to explain to her what it meant when a person did something without calculating the cost first. She said he had used the word integrity and then set it aside and said actually what he did was simpler than that. He just didn't think about himself in that moment. And that was the rarest thing. I listened and I drank my coffee, and I thought about a young man with headphones around his neck sitting on a curb in October, and about all the Fridays at the kitchen table on Clement Street, and about a birthday text with a photograph of a skyline I had kept on my phone through 3 phone upgrades, simply because I hadn't been able to bring myself to delete it. I thought about how the connections that shape a life most profoundly are often the quietest ones, not the grand events or the formal relationships, but the afternoons that arrive without announcement and stay longer than expected, and leave something behind that you only understand years later. Margaret told me that the legal process would take several weeks, that the estate attorneys needed to verify documentation, process the formal identification requirements, and execute the transfer according to the specific terms James had outlined in the will. She said that in the interim, and at her own initiative rather than any legal obligation, she had arranged accommodations for me at a hotel near the waterfront where I could recover properly from the surgery without the physical and logistical strain of the shelter system. I began to object, and she looked at me with an expression that reminded me so precisely of her father's particular brand of quiet firmness that I stopped mid-sentence. She said, "Mr. Harris, my father spent the last 8 months of his life making sure this moment happened correctly. Please allow me to honor that." I said, "All right." I said, "Thank you." The words felt insufficient and entirely necessary at the same time. The hotel room was on the 4th floor with a window that faced the river, and on the first evening I sat in the chair by that window and watched the water move in the late light, and I tried to locate myself inside what had happened, to find the solid ground in the new geography of it. $14 million is an abstraction when you say it quickly, and an entirely different thing when you sit alone in a room and allow it to become real. When you trace the line from the pharmacy bag you dropped on Burnside Street 15 years ago, to the chair where you are sitting, and follow all the ordinary days between those 2 points. All the mornings you made coffee in the kitchen on Clement Street, and the evenings you watched the news, and the Fridays you thought of a young man building a life somewhere, and felt the uncomplicated warmth of knowing a good thing had continued without you. I sat with all of it, and let it settle slowly, the way sediment settles in water when the movement finally stops. And at some point in the settling, I understood that what I felt most was not joy, or relief, or vindication, but something quieter and more fundamental. The feeling of being seen. Of having a life that had been lived mostly without witness, be recognized by someone who had paid attention, and who had found the means and the will to say so, in a way that could not be undone. Derek called on a Thursday evening, 11 days after Margaret had found me on the shelter steps. I had not contacted him. I had made a deliberate choice to say nothing until the legal process was further along, partly because I wanted concrete information rather than possibilities, and partly because I needed the 11 days to understand what I wanted the conversation to be, what I wanted to carry into it, and what I wanted to leave outside the door. The call surprised me because I had not expected him to reach out first, and for a moment, when I saw his name on the screen, I felt the old reflex, the parental instinct toward reconciliation, toward meeting whatever was being offered even at a disadvantage, toward finding a way through. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. He said, "Dad, I've been hearing things." His voice had a quality I recognized from his childhood, the particular tightness that arrived when Derek understood he had misjudged something and was still in the process of deciding how to account for it. I said, "What kinds of things, Derek?" He said, "Sandra's friend works at a law firm downtown. She mentioned your name in connection with the Way estate." A pause. "Is it true? Did James Way leave you money?" I said James Way left me a portion of his estate, yes. Another pause, longer this time. Then Derek said, in a voice that was working very hard to sound casual and not succeeding, "Dad, I think we should get together. Talk things through. There's obviously been some distance between us, and I don't think that's good for anyone." I held the phone, and I looked at the river through the window, and I thought about a hospital bench and a 4-mile walk and a shelter bed on Morrison Street. I thought about you made your choices, and now live with them. I thought about, I can't keep being responsible for the consequences of choices you made before I was even born. I thought about 3 words. Hope the surgery went well. Sent on the 4th day of an 11-day hospitalization. And I thought about the sound of a call ending before I had finished speaking. I held all of it not with bitterness. I want to be precise about that, because bitterness and honesty are different things. But with the clear-eyed attention of a man who has learned in the past 11 days to be accurate about what things are. I said, "Derek, I want to say something to you, and I want to say it simply so that there's no confusion about what I mean." He said, "Okay." I said, "I have loved you since before you were born. I have loved you through every version of you that you have presented to me in 44 years, including the versions that were difficult to love. That has not changed, and will not change. But I also need you to know that I remember exactly what was said, and what was not said, and what was done, and what was not done in the past several weeks. And I am not able to allow you to revise that history simply because the circumstances have changed." A silence. I said, "I am not angry at you, Derek. I am something more permanent than angry. I am clear." Another silence, longer. I said, "When you're ready to have an honest conversation, not about the estate, not about finances, but about what happened between a father and a son, I'll be here. But I won't pretend that conversation is about anything other than what it's actually about." He said, "Dad, I made mistakes. I know that. But you have to understand the position I was in. Sandra and I had just..." I said, "Derek." He stopped. I said, "Not yet. When you're ready to have it honestly." Then I said goodnight, and I set the phone down and I sat for a while longer at the window with the river moving below in the evening light, steady and unhurried, indifferent to everything on its banks in the way that water is indifferent and beautiful for the same reason. Margaret called the following week to tell me the documentation had cleared and that the estate attorneys were ready to proceed with the formal transfer process. She said there was paperwork to be reviewed and signed, that her father's attorneys were thorough, and she wanted me to have my own counsel present, and that she had taken the liberty of contacting a firm she trusted if I did not have a preference. I said that was fine. She said there was one more thing. She said her father had left a second instruction in the will, not a legal requirement, but a personal request, which she had been holding until this moment, because she hadn't wanted it to feel transactional. She said James had asked that once Thomas Harris was found and the estate process was underway, Margaret was to offer him something else, not money, not legal arrangements, but a standing Friday lunch invitation. She said, "My father wanted you to know that the table is still set. He said you'd understand what that meant." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said yes. I said, "Tell him I understand." She said she would. The way she said it, present tense, unhesitating, as though the distance between a daughter and a father is a technicality that grief has not yet succeeded in making permanent, was the most human thing I heard in all of those weeks. And I did not comment on it because some things are more respectfully left intact than examined. I signed the papers on a Wednesday morning in a law office on the 14th floor of a building downtown, seated at a long table with 2 estate attorneys and Margaret and my own counsel, and the particular quality of silence that formal rooms hold when something significant is about to become irreversible. I read every page the way James would have wanted me to read it, carefully, without performance, giving each word the attention it was due. When I reached the last signature line, I held the pen for a moment, and I thought about a Tuesday evening, and a pharmacy bag, and 18 inches, and a boy with headphones sitting on a curb in October. I thought about 32 Friday afternoons at a kitchen table. I thought about a birthday text and a Seattle skyline and a letter in handwritten script that ended with the word concrete. Then I signed my name, slowly, completely, the way a man signs something he intends to mean. I moved into a small apartment on the east side of the city in early May, when the surgery had healed enough that the body had stopped announcing itself with every movement and had returned to the background where bodies belong when they are functioning as they should. It was not a large apartment, and it was not in a fashionable part of the city, and I chose it for the same reason I had chosen everything I had ever chosen. Because it was honest. Because it fit the shape of who I actually was, rather than the shape of who circumstances had temporarily made possible, and because the kitchen window faced east and caught the morning light at an angle that reminded me without effort of the kitchen on Clement Street. Margaret and I have lunch on Fridays. Not every Friday. She travels. I have appointments. Life intercedes in the way that life does. But most of them. We go to a small restaurant near the waterfront, where the corner table by the window is understood to be ours without anyone having formally arranged it, the way certain things become true through repetition rather than declaration. We talk about her father the way people talk about someone who is still genuinely present in the conversation, whose opinions and observations still arrive with enough force to be worth disagreeing with. And I find in those afternoons the same quality I found in 32 Friday lunches at a kitchen table on Clement Street. The ease of being with someone who is there simply because they want to be. Derek and I spoke again in June.
He came to the apartment alone, without Sandra, without the careful social scaffolding he deploys in situations where he feels exposed. He sat in the kitchen, and he was quiet for a long time before he said anything. And what he finally said was not an explanation or a justification, but something closer to the truth. That he had been afraid, his whole life, of ending up with nothing, and that the fear had made him capable of things he did not want to be capable of. I listened.
I did not absolve him, and I did not condemn him. I made coffee, and I set a cup in front of him, and I said that fear was something I understood, and that what mattered now was what he chose to do with the understanding of it. We are not where we were. We are not yet where we might be, but we are in the same room, which is where repair has to begin, if it is going to begin at all. I think about James Way most mornings, about a curb in October, and a paper bag, and the 18 inches that changed 2 lives without either of us knowing it at the time. I think about how quietly the most important things arrive, without announcement, without the weight they will eventually carry, looking for all the world like an ordinary Tuesday evening on an ordinary street in an ordinary life, which is, I have come to understand, exactly where the extraordinary always hides.